Foundation for what's next. My name is Jonathan Lee, Field Marketing Manager at Treasure Data, a leading provider of enterprise customer data platforms, or CDPs. I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers today, Mark Childs and Mickey Collart. Mark is the Senior Vice President of Digital as well as the Chief Digital Officer at Heart Energy, and Mickey Collart is a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Treasure Data. For some quick housekeeping, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available immediately after the presentation. Feel free to click and download the attachments below your screen. And lastly, we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions during or after today's session, please submit them below and we'll do our best to answer them. And we'll be doing a quick Q&A session at the very end. Without further ado, here's Mickey and Mark.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. As Jonathan already introduced, I'm Mickey Collart. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at RM Treasure Data. And before we have Mark go in and introduce himself, I just wanted to go ahead and take you through a short agenda so you know what to expect for today. I'm going to go ahead and bring up that agenda now. So there were some questions that we really wanted to dig into today, and it just so happens that if you're going to put on a CDO's perspective, you absolutely have to have a Chief Digital Officer. So again, we're really excited to have Mark with us. And I don't think I could do these questions justice without having him here today. So we're going to start with, what does it mean to be data-driven? Right. And I have found a really great survey report that we can dive into that gives us sort of the state of marketing operations today and how they're driving towards being data-driven. We'll look at why being data-driven is important. I guess we're already assuming that it is, but there are some really interesting statistics about performance when you start to improve data-driven operations. And then we'll dive into what it takes to improve on your data-driven skills, talent, processes, those sorts of things. And then we'll touch on technology and how that can help improve data-driven decisions and outcomes. But I have some more resources for you, so we'll get to those at the end for that, answering that question specifically. So with that, I just want to welcome Mark again to the webinar. Thank you so much for being here today. And I just want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and your role at Heart Energy.
Thanks, Mickey, and thanks, Treasure Data, for having me. My name is Mark Childs. I am the Chief Digital Officer and Senior VP of Digital at Heart Energy. I've been there for just over 12 and a half years, and I've really seen a significant change in the whole media dynamic. For those that don't know who we are, we've been around since '73, and we really started out as a traditional publishing company with a directory. Since then, we've done acquisitions, we've added data sets and things of that nature, and really now we have several business lines. Digital media, which that's what I am responsible for, and that's our newsletters, our apps, our websites, our platforms, and anything that has to do with digital revenue. And then we have our print publications, which we have a flagship magazine, which is Oil and Gas Investor. It's been around for a very long time. We have E&P magazine, which is actually going all digital. It's actually about to launch its first fully digital E&P Plus next month. So be on the lookout for that. We have an events division, which if everybody has paid attention to this year, the pandemic has kind of changed that whole dynamic as well. So I've been a real key factor in digitizing our events for this year. And so actually, as we speak, we have our first virtual event going on right now. And that's performing very well. And it's a difference driver of how we can look at the way of presenting information to people that we may not have been able to reach before. So that's actually really paramount for the shift in media and events. And then we also have a data services arm, which is RexTag, based out of San Diego, and they do GIS data sets, digital mapping software, and further energy assets data. My background, a little bit about me, I actually started out in IT. That was kind of my bread and butter, starting out, coming right out of college. And then I worked more into learning software engineering and going down that path. And then I went over to the dark side of business, which is kind of where I'm at now. So I've been a key player in digital transformation, not just for our company, but for helping other companies. I am a member of the Forbes Technology Council. I'm a board member on the Digital Officers Advisory Board for BPA Worldwide, which is a very well-known auditing company for the media space. And then I've been asked to speak, similar to events like this, on digital transformation, marketing, and audience information, and big data. So this is a really interesting and important topic of being data-driven. And I think a lot of people are starting to really understand kind of what that means for their business. But I feel like there's always more that we can talk about and learn from it. So I think that's kind of why we're here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that introduction. So Mark brings a wealth of experience. And like I said, I really don't think that I could start to even answer some of these questions that we've posed today without him being here. So we're going to try and dig into that first question. So what does it mean to be data-driven? I was able to find a really nice report around the data-driven mindset. That title sort of intrigued me. And then as I started to read through the executive summary, this quote hit me. And it hit me because it poses two things that I think just aren't independent at all against each other just a little bit. So it says that today, the driving force behind the world's most innovative companies isn't only best-in-class talent, though it's critical, and we all believe that, I'm sure. The overwhelming force pushing high-growth companies forward is a mindset. And so, of course, mindset, data-driven mindset, it's right there in the title, and it's still at that point while I was looking at it, mystified me. What do they mean by a mindset? Okay, of course, there's talent, there's skills, there's people who are data-driven like Mark is in companies, yet they're talking about a mindset in a different context, right? So, of course, they'll go on to talk about the data-driven mindset and their conclusions about the current state of marketing organizations and pursuit of better data-driven operations. And I really liked the flow of the report, too. They really sort of dug into the components of that data-driven mindset. Basically, they wanted to understand what it takes to establish this mindset, and their conclusion, which probably isn't going to be a huge surprise, was that it came down to culture. So they're not just talking about people and talent having a data-driven mindset, they're talking about having a culture that elevates that, right? That brings it to the forefront, that keeps it moving. The telling statistic here was that 50% of respondents said their organization's culture doesn't actively support data-driven decision-making specifically. And so what you're seeing on the slide are just some of the findings from the report. However, something that really hit me was the fact that by far and by about 10 basis points, most marketers reported they just didn't have time to make data-driven decisions. And I think for me, that means a couple of things. So somebody answering that question could be thinking, well, I don't have the skills, or I don't have the talent on my team. And I don't have time to make this data work for me. And then secondarily, they could be thinking, and it may not be my priority, right? I can get by with what I'm doing. So they pulled out from the study that people were definitely documenting a strategy for using data. that people had established KPIs and were definitely measuring those periodically and changing course depending on what they were seeing. And that they could get to the data that was currently available to them. They had the right knowledge and skills to be able to use that data, but they weren't using the breadth of that data. So while these are all things and all steps in the right direction, the report sort of points out that respondents still had trouble, and they had trouble with inconsistent processes, they had trouble with collaboration, they had trouble with access to the right data and the right actionable intelligence, even though they knew how to use it well. So I think the pivotal question in this survey to kind of sum up the current state of the data-driven mindset was, how would you describe your measurement and monitoring? And they wanted people to categorize themselves based on their level of data-driven capability. And you can see here that over 2/3 of respondents don't see themselves with the agility and consistency needed to achieve that really high level of data-driven decision-making. And then less than 30% saw themselves as these active responders, right? That were able to kind of consistently monitor performance and metrics and change their approach. And it's not saying anything about the timing on that, by the way. So it's an interesting idea. But my big takeaway from all of this was, okay, I would agree with the report that data-driven and being data-driven is really an ethos. It doesn't just live within maybe a few groups, a functional group per se, but it needs to be sort of pervasive throughout an organization or pervasive throughout a division, and it needs to come from the top. It needs to be a part of the strategy. And then another big takeaway, of course, was that the state of data and analytics and insights, what needs to happen there is that things just need to be more usable for line of business folks like marketers, right? So if we are talking about the data-driven marketer, that they just need better ways of working with data, better ways of working with the intelligence that they get. So that's great and all. Those are, sort of my thoughts on what I've read so far. But we have Mark, and he's here, and he lives this day in and day out. So I definitely want to bring him in and ask him a couple of questions around this. Mark, so what would you say is, data-driven success for you in your organization overall?
Well, I think before that, I think, from an audience perspective, I think when you're looking at data or just the thought of data, you have to ask yourself, what questions are you trying to answer? I mean, every company is going to be different. What they're trying to accomplish isn't necessarily what every other company is trying to accomplish. However, as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. For us, as far as being data-driven, we're looking at it from a media perspective. And from a media perspective, I mean from the editorial side, what people are reading on our website, if they're coming from an ad in a magazine through to an advertiser's promotion, whether that's to a website, a full website landing page, where they're trying to get them to buy something, but also tying that data into a subscriber. If somebody hits 3 or 4 or 5 free articles and then they hit a paywall article, are they more likely to buy? Are they more likely to come back later? Like we're trying to associate all of those things more from a customer journey standpoint, from subscription purchases. And that could be a person that comes on and just signs up just to be a registered user to get the newsletters. That's a subscriber, but it's not a paying subscriber. So then the question is, how do you walk them up? When you're looking at the user personas that the data is telling you, it gives you a better idea of how you can market the right message to the right person. It's changing. The whole dynamic of account-based marketing has been changing over the last few years. Firstly, it was spray and pray. send an email to as many people as you possibly can. And then it became, let's target, the companies that we want to reach. Say that you have a company that has 1,000 people. Is the product you're selling going to resonate to the janitor? Even if you have his email address, does it really matter? So that whole account-based marketing aspect doesn't work. And that, genre of trying to reach the right person. So then you really have to look at who are the people that are using your products? How are they using your products? Ours are media focused, but we also have the events, the in-person events. And then you start to tie the detail of registration to actually checking in and attending the event. And then potentially they become now maybe a subscriber. Or on the flip side of that, maybe they're an advertiser in one of the magazines. You can get them to potentially be an exhibitor or a sponsor at an event. So it starts to tie all that together. And we're looking at the attribution modeling of all of that offline to online type dynamic, as well as the online, what makes the most sense? Where do people open their wallet and buy something from you, right? What is the buying behavior and how can you associate that to revenue growth? That's what we're all in business to really do. So that's how we're defining success. And it's a hard thing to just have an absolute, here's the measurement of success, because it's always moving. To one of your earlier slides, it really is about adapting and changing to the information that you see. You shouldn't just be stuck in a model and only using that model forever, because you will be behind. You're behind almost immediately if you get stuck doing that. And so that information allows the marketing team to be able to create customized campaigns, work with sales, understand the dynamic of why people are buying something, whether it's based on the information that we're putting out, or it's an audience that we're potentially providing access to from an advertiser.
So that's interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is that, success isn't defined with just the 5 KPIs that you're measuring at, any given point in time, or the KPIs that you've measured over and over again, but rather that you need to start to analyze your business in terms of what's working, what's happening now, going on the same things, are people converting, and then being able to change up the measure, the mark, right, in order to improve. So that's really cool takeaway. So just tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're helping your marketing achieve with data specifically.
Really, so we do a marketing audit every week or every other week of the campaigns that are taking place across the board. And that's how we're using email, social, whether it's paid advertising or organic advertising, and earned versus owned media, and how we can use all those things to better increase the conversion ratio. And so looking at what's worked, say we sent an email campaign out that was trying to drive a trial subscription. The message may be, you need this information. But then need it's a difficult word to justify a lot of times. So then you kind of change up. You look at the analytics from that. If you send it out to 1,000 people, how many of those people open it? How many click through? From the click throughs, what's your conversion rate? If your conversion rate is 1% on average, then you need to look at how you can increase it. What's the way to double that? When you get that to 2%? Is it the message itself and the body of the email? Is it in the subject line? Is it a multitude of things? So we'll take that information and change accordingly. Things that work well, we continue to push on, but we'll then start to use those to morph into the other business lines. Maybe we want to use something similar to that. Say, hey, we know that your company has subscribers. Maybe you're interested at coming to our event, because we're going to talk about even more in-depth information live right now with CEO of the oil company, and they're going to be able to provide a better in-depth understanding as opposed to just what we wrote right now. So it's taking all those things and putting them together and creating a continuous flow of information to the marketing team, to the sales team, and getting everybody on the same page with what's working, what's not, so that we can always be iterating the process. Iteration comes up in software engineering a lot. You're continually putting out new product releases and things of that nature. But you have to start taking that technological aspect and putting that to the business side. And if you could put that into the business side, it starts to change how your business flows. Now it's not just your software team that's now agile, your company becomes agile. And everybody working in that kind of methodology allows you to be nimble and change according to the market dynamics. I mean, for us being in oil and gas, that's all the time. So we have to be very aware and cognizant of what's changing from the market. And then that data tells us that faster than we can go out and ask people for that.
Yeah. And you bring up a very interesting concept, and one I think that we kind of all take for granted a little bit. When we talk about being data-driven, we talk about marketing analytics. I think some people think of it in context of strategy, right? Things, again, back to all the things that we've always measured. Think of the executive dashboard, right?
Right.
And then somebody on a quarterly, semi-annual basis makes decisions about the marketing mix or the budget. But what you're talking about is just being operational, being data-driven and applying what you're learning every single day or even by the hour to your operations overall. And I see two sides of analytics and intelligence and being a data-driven organization. And I think the rubber hits the road when you start to use that sort of journey analytics to make hourly or day-to-day decisions. It's just it's kind of a different game.
Yeah, and from a broader strategic planning aspect, company-wide, you can be looking at those from a leadership standpoint. You can create, like you said, executive dashboards. But then what's the takeaway from that? And that's how you start to associate next steps. In the more, it goes down the team, obviously everything rolls downhill. They're the ones that are going to have to implement it. But you really have to be able to understand what you're looking at. And you have to get executive buy-in, to start with data and to be a data-driven organization. You can't do it unless you have somebody at the top that's really, that champion, that's pushing it to get it there. Otherwise, you're dead on arrival.
Yeah. Okay. You heard it here, folks. It is, we're going back. It really is about that culture, right? Driving that culture. So let's go on and let's talk about some of the other questions that we wanted to answer today. We want to dig in a little bit about, why it's important. So I have presented this study in the past, but I think it's a great one. BCG, Boston Consulting Group, was commissioned by Google for an in-depth study on digital marketing maturity. They wanted to develop a model across industries that demonstrated digital marketing success. And I'll just preface this. Well, this is a digital marketing study. They really make digital marketing here synonymous with data-driven marketing. One of the first things that they summarize for the report is that most mature marketers, or what I put down here, AKA the best marketers, make data-driven and digital ways of working the norm. And then they go on to quickly define what those best marketers are doing consistently. So the best marketers connect their data, right? They connect all the dots, they connect all the touch points. They use that data for end-to-end measurement, as we were just discussing, and message to reach their customers, the right customers at the right time. They also build in-depth understanding of the entire customer journey. So they're connecting everything, like you had talked about earlier, Mark, online and offline. They also know how and where to coordinate and focus their engagement efforts. So really what that means is that they're understanding the data, they understand what it means when it gets to them. New data they can take in because they have the skills to do that, and they know what they're looking at and make it actionable. So that gives us kind of a nice little preview of what they're talking about in terms of having that high level of data-driven skill. And so to talk a little bit more about, why it's important, they did this in context of a maturity model. And they wanted people to be able to sort of take away how you sort of move, how you improve, right, through this maturity model. And they didn't just do a survey. Boston Consulting Group went in with clients and ran experiments with them. So I think they had lined up like 8 to 10 worldwide corporations, right, that they went in and did these studies with. And so they found out through some of these experiments that companies that have achieved multi-moment maturity, so this is the pinnacle, this is where you're ultimately a mature data-driven operation, right? And those organizations reported cost savings of up to 30% and revenue increases of as much as 20%. So the business impact is, mostly attributed to these very mature organizations again, but those organizations being able to deliver relevant content to customers and consumers at multiple moments across the purchasing journey, right? To be very specific. And so if we wanted to take a look at their actual model, we can do that. These are the 4 levels of that model. There's nascent, emerging, connected, and multi-moment, as we just talked about. The authors of the report point out that the overwhelming majority of companies that they surveyed, about 90%, fell into the emerging and connected levels. So those 2 in the middle. So kind of consistent to what we saw in the other survey. People are working things out. They've got a lot of skills underneath them to be data-driven. But only 2% of the participants were in that multi-moment level. And kind of what this means for me is basically the ability to optimize campaigns across channels while following customers through a very specific journey. It's really hard. It's very hard to do, right? But people are getting there. And then they also wanted to obviously deliver the model, right? And they wanted the people to be able to understand how they could up their game as they move from one level to the next. So for example, and these are just, I'll note that these are just technical enablers, right? And I'll give you some examples here. Data-driven marketers, they can employ unification processes to link their customer touch points together across systems, across functions. They think that this will help them understand their customer journeys better. They can also start to segment audiences based on their behavior and get a deeper, richer view into their ideal campaign targets. And Mark talked about that a little bit earlier. And then as they move up, as they move from, like, say, connected to that multi-moment category, they're ensuring that online and offline touch points are connected so that they have a complete look at the journey. They're not just talking about a digital journey versus an offline journey. And so those can be used by marketers across those digital and traditional channels, right? And then they're also beginning to connect the dots between measurable KPIs in different channels. And that helps them to attribute their campaign costs appropriately, right? They can assess what's working and adjust, just like we've been talking about. And again, I'm just showing the technical enablers for the model. There's definitely other factors in the maturity model for organizational processes, for skills and talent. But, while we're on the topic of those, operations, let's go ahead and go back to the conversation with Mark. So he runs, obviously, a data-driven operation. So we'd really like to hear a little bit more about what are some of the data-driven processes that you've employed at Hart. You've already talked about a few of them. But how does your organization support these processes?
Well, one of the first things that we looked at doing, we kind of went down this journey, was how many systems we had, how many Excel sheets we had, how many Access databases, how many different systems that we had that did not have some sort of circular information flow. And there was a lot. So one of the first things we employed was just really putting all of the systems to connect in one data set so that we have a huge data lake. And I say huge for us, we're about 5.3 billion records right now. I just looked at it earlier today. So there's a lot of information, and that's our analytics data from our websites, that's our conference registrants, that is our information from our email marketing systems. We've had multiple email marketing systems in the past, multiple CRMs. Putting all that information together gives you a central repository to be able to work from. And then you can start to detail the information out from there. So now we can do cross-querying between our conference information from a registrant to our subscriber user database and see if there's one and the same. See when people have gone to multiple conferences before, if they've subscribed to different products before, but now maybe they're just subscribed to one. Possibly they were on their own single person subscription and now their company has gotten a corporate site license, but it looks like that person is no longer a subscriber. It's hard to identify those sorts of things if you don't have it in a central location. So putting all that together was really first and foremost, and then being able to get information back out of it. Some of it we have information flow back out to Marketo is our email system that we're using, and we have a lot of information coming in and going back out to it so that we can create specific audiences, whether we want to do an ad bridge connection with, say, a Facebook ad on a certain persona of somebody, maybe they're just a registered user and they go to the site, but they want to move on, and maybe that person is also gone to our conference website and they looked at the registration page, but they didn't register. Like starting to bring those sorts of things into the mix was really important for us. And so that took a long time. That was not quick. That was not easy. But understanding that was really kind of the first step to get there was going to be big. And now we're able to use that data all the time. That information flowed back out to the other systems. Our marketing team, they're in Marketo all the time. I don't necessarily need them to be in our CDP, but I need our CDP to feed information back out to Marketo so they can start to create campaigns around that user persona. So it's not just the platform itself being the key, it's how you get the information to and from it. And one of the other big things around that too is analyzing that information based on people, for us in the subscription side of things, from a churn propensity. So if we see a certain type of person who doesn't go to the website very much, they don't read very many articles, why are they not doing that? That person is most likely going to cancel their subscription or not renew. So we have to start looking at those things too. It's like, what is that type of persona? What's the percentage of people that we have that have that type of persona? And what do we need to do to re-engage with them? Like those sorts of things become a much more longer term ROI if you could start to determine how those users are currently in your system, what's the information that you have around them, and how do you get back out in front of them. If you're doing all that from a spreadsheet, good luck. I don't envy you at all. But at the same time, you have to be able to have a good way to process that information and understand that user transition. And that was a huge thing for us, being able to look at churn propensity and be able to say these types of people that paid this amount of money and only go to the site, say 2 times a month, they're never going to renew. So now it's like, okay, these are the types of folks that we need to get extra care with. We need to have a little bit more of an outreach to them, whether that's personal direct from maybe an account rep, maybe that is an email campaign that's automated just based on a certain time frame from a retention policy standpoint, or different things like that. So we're doing a lot of those sorts of interesting things, and if they work, they work. If they don't, well, okay, you wasted a little bit of time, you learn more. You know, there's the adage in sales, ABC, always be closing. Well, I look at it from a different standpoint. It should be ABL, always be learning. Don't ever stop, because then you're going to miss something.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective to have. And it sounds like you really have gained some efficiencies, obviously, in the process overall. That's definitely what I'm hearing. So what do you think is next? Are you as efficient as you want to be, or, you know, what are you thinking about in terms of improving those processes today? And then what's in your future?
I think really from us, it's more of training internally, getting people to understand how to use the information better. Passing the information back out is kind of the first step on getting people to use that. But then as people start to ask more pointed questions like, where did that data come from? How can we use that? Are we sure that that's accurate and representative of what we thought? Because there's always a little bit of, I guess, hesitancy to a certain degree, where what you think within inside your four walls is the actual word. But then when you start to break that out and show people that things are changing, again, earlier in the presentation, it's about the culture, it's about the mindset. And if you can't get them to shift that, you have to show that. And sometimes it's asking for forgiveness, not permission, and then just kind of pushing the envelope and showing what you can do with it. So that doesn't necessarily say how we would potentially improve, but that's kind of helping others to kind of get past maybe a barrier they may have, you know, internally. But then being able to take our processes, really what I want to look at from a standpoint is personalized content. Is there a way that we can start to build out a different feature within our sites, within our apps, based on the information that we're learning, based on user behavior that changes maybe what they see? We have a little bit of AI currently on our site that does do content recommendations based on the behavior of the site, but it's not wholly personal. It's really just, if you went to different areas on the site, it starts to build that persona and showcase content recommendations. But maybe you were just going there from an exploratory standpoint. Doesn't necessarily mean that's your interest. So now we want to be able to take that really to the next level and be able to provide a fully personalized experience, not just on your user experience on the website, but maybe this now becomes a completely dynamic newsletter that goes out to you based on only the specific factors of content that you really have an ideation in. You know, and this is what you want to see versus what we thought you wanted to see. Then you're kind of building your own, I don't know, personal experience, if you will. And that, from a media standpoint, becomes much more beneficial than, here's all the stuff we have, please come and read it. You know, and so then it starts to take into account, how can you push that to an offline experience? And that's way down the road. We're not Google doing moonshots, but I think there are some of those sorts of things that can really kind of come out of it. Data is much more imperative to the benefit of a business now than I think it really ever has been. Mainly just because processing power is there. Versus just even 5 years ago. I mean, if you look 10 years ago, data-driven, you know, not even a part of anybody's vocabulary. But even 5 years ago, when really things started to change and transition and computing power became more accessible and less expensive for people to try to do these things, it really kind of changed that whole arena of what data meant and how you can actually do data science and different things like that you really just couldn't do before. Not that you couldn't do it before, but you couldn't do it nearly as easily as you can now. And platforms like Treasure Data make that a much more ease of use, if you will, to get into the data environment.
Yeah. I tell our story a little bit. Actually, I tell our story quite often. But that was that was the thought. That was the original thought behind Treasure Data, was that, we could see the data exploding, 10 years back, 11 years back. And people were going to need talent to come in. And we're still talking about the talent gap today around data science. It's great to hear that you are using data at that level. If you're doing churn propensity, you're on the top of your game, because people are still talking about how to get there. So we're going to need more tools. We're going to need more talent. You've obviously employed some great processes to get to the point that you are where you are. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I have one little item, because I want to just make sure that our audience has something to take away. So as a part of this series, what we wanted to do is provide some free data-driven marketers guides. These are like 4 areas that marketers should really focus on, kind of technology areas for better data-driven results. So we'll make sure that everybody who's registered for this webinar gets a link back to these marketers guides, and also get some links to the studies that we had talked about today. So we just want to make sure that you have those resources going away. These guides are really short format. They're easy to read. They do have some technical detail in there, but they'll also point to some additional resources as well. So with that, Jonathan, I think we are going to be ready for some questions here.
Well, thank you both for the insightful presentation. Before we dive into questions, I'd like to quickly introduce our sponsor, Treasure Data. For close to a decade, we've been helping brands solve complex data problems as one of the earliest customer data platforms, or CDPs. Our enterprise CDP empowers brands with rich customer insights that drive outstanding customer experiences. With advanced data management capabilities at the core, we enable brands to identify, engage, and acquire customers efficiently, all within a flexible, scalable, and secure environment. As Treasure Data continues to grow in revenue and welcomes new enterprises to our 400+ global customers across many industries like automotive and CPG, please feel free to check us out at www.treasuredata.com. And now let's get on with the show and go into some Q&A.
Jonathan, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, I can't hear you either.
Oh my. So I guess we should start really quickly with a bunch of questions. There's maybe 8. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Awesome.
So to kick off, the first question is, what about hardware companies and the old print media? What is a data-driven organization when the primary data sources are offline?
Well, I think that really kind of depends on what your offline data sources are. So I know, actually in what Jonathan just showed, some of, say, like the automotive companies, the way that they're looking at offline to online transition is they'll have their, somebody sign up to come and test drive a car. And so, okay, they did it online, and then their offline to online transition is when that person comes into the dealership, and then say they're connected to the dealership's Wi-Fi, and they can then associate that customer to, now they've actually come and shown up, and there's the offline to online conversion, if you will. And a lot of times, that, I think that was a huge driver for Subaru a few years ago, and how they actually did that. But as far as the old print media, so don't get me wrong, I'm in the media game, and we have a print magazine that's been around for, well, longer than me, to be honest. And so what we look at from that standpoint is we have paid subscriptions to it, as well as we have paid advertising. And then we want to be able to take that and look at how we can expand it. What's the user, experience? Have they been a magazine subscriber for 5 minutes? Have they been a magazine subscriber for 15 years? And then what's the relationship? In oil and gas, there's obviously still the very significant relationship factor there that we want to try to maintain. And so from the data sources being offline, I think it really just kind of depends what your goals are as an organization. Where does data fit into that? Data doesn't necessarily need to be a goal itself, but I think depending on what you're trying to accomplish, data becomes part of that strategic plan.
Great. Another question. I think there's two of the same or very similar questions. Both are in reference to COVID. The first way of asking it is, how do you build a data-driven culture in a company that has other imminent problems to solve in the short term? And the other version of that was, our team, in reference to the very last bit, our team has an ABC mindset because of the short-term goals that need to be accomplished during COVID. What advice can you give to transition that to always be learning ABL?
Those are really good questions. And I think looking at the culture, so like I said, I was in IT first, and then trying to get digital transformation going. And it has not been a short road by any means. It's been several years to try to get people to come through it. What we had to look at, and we're kind of in the same boat too, you know, as far as the short-term goals, just let's get through 2020 and hopefully 2021 will be better, although hope is not a plan. The short-term type stuff, it really depends on what you're trying to do. The thing in data, it's not a short-term. So the data component is going to be, you start now, and probably by Q4, if you start now, depending on how much data you have and how many data sets you have to integrate, you may be using it by Q4, but it's going to have to start somewhere. Somebody has to spearhead it, own it, and say, this is where we're going to go with it. Now, you may not necessarily be able to answer all of the questions on all of the things that you're going to do with it just yet, but until you start somewhere, you're still kind of spinning your wheels. And as far as changing the mindset, this is where the ask for forgiveness comes into play. Sometimes you just have to go out and do it and show some of the benefits and the ROI impact from it. And then you'll generally start to get the buy-in. Not everybody is going to change to always be learning. You know, some people just want to sell that product, get that dollar in, and move on to the next one. They're not necessarily going to want to necessarily learn more. However, as an organization, if you can get the key stakeholders in the company to start down that path, then they will then kind of change the culture organically over time. It's not going to be immediate, and it's definitely going to take somebody continuing to push it. You know, the whole squeaky wheel is the one that gets heard. You got to keep pushing it. Believe me, I pushed it for a long time. But at that same time, you have your short-term revenue goals to make. The sales team really has to be out there. The account team has to be out there still trying to close that gap of any revenue deficits you may have. But you have to have somebody that's also going to start turning the tides a little bit, if you will, to start that data process.
Great answer. Thank you. Another question is, I think it's a point of clarification. What's the difference between connected and multi-moment?
Yeah. So when I looked at the maturity model, and we only, like I said, we only looked at the portion that talked about the technology enablers. But what they were really trying to get at, and you didn't see a lot there in technology enablers that would get you from, you know, say connected to this multi-moment category. But what they're talking about is something that we had touched on earlier. It's understanding and using data to drive decisions throughout the journey. So one of the top things that they highlighted was that you're connecting all your data points, you're connecting those things from the digital world to the offline world, which is kind of a leap. And it's very hard to do. And a part of that multi-moment process is being able to capture somebody's intent at the moment, right? So whether they're on your website or potentially in your store, being able to leverage that data in almost near real time, right? So again, we're talking about making decisions on an hourly basis, or, you know, a decision from the morning to the next morning, you know, one day at a time kind of thing. So that's what they sort of mean by multi-moment. They don't talk a lot about real time specifically, but you can see it interlaced between those two categories. And it was pretty clear to me that that's really kind of what they're getting at. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Another question we have is, do you think having the data lake built before implementing the CDP helps with the CDP implementation process? Either of you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I would say yes. So we actually used one of the same. So we actually did use Treasure Data for both the data lake and the CDP. But first and foremost, it was absolutely about getting the data lake built. If we didn't have that, CDP wouldn't do us any good. I think looking at our sources, I think we have probably 50 different data sets coming into Treasure Data. And that by itself, from start to finish, when we were really able to start to do some querying and to make some business decisions, was probably about 6 months. So it took us a significant amount of time. But I do believe that having the data lake built first is almost absolutely imperative.
Gotcha. And we have one final question. And by the way, anybody in the audience, if your question isn't answered, we're happy to answer them after the webinar as well. The last question is, for companies relying mostly on third-party data online today, everybody says to look at first-party data. If everything is about first-party data, how do you make the pivot if your company is a company that has hundreds of customer records rather than hundreds of thousands of records? That makes sense.
I mean, for the difficulty is the whole privacy aspect. I mean, with cookie changes coming, GDPR, CCPA, I think those are going to be across the board before too long, maybe, you know, as early as next year, 2022, as more states kind of come on board. Your first party data really becomes really, really valuable. However, the way that we're looking at it is we are connecting first party data and third party data, trying to build out that persona aspect of types of people. And then I think that's going to give you a stronger understanding of what inferred data that you may not necessarily have. You know, if you look at Google Analytics, it's telling you users and visitors, but you don't know who those people are. But if you can start to associate their behavior with like behavior of your first party data, you have a broader opportunity of maybe providing a customized ad solution or a customized messaging solution to those types of people. And that's where the whole personalized experience type comes in. It's difficult, I think, right now to understand what the third party data market kind of looks like in another 6, 12 to 18 months, but I do think that it is going to be drastically different. Making that pivot, I mean, it's going to be slightly different for everybody, but for us, I mean, right now we're going to use as much data as we possibly could still get and keep and be in compliance, because we are focused heavily on being in compliance.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank both of you for making this compelling presentation. So quick reminder to the audience to explore the rest of our Bright Talk channel, where you can find on-demand and upcoming webinars. You can view this one right away afterwards. So thanks everybody for joining us today. You guys have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jonathan.